The scream tore from Grace Owens's throat before she even knew she was awake. Her body drenched in sweat and tangled in the thin blankets of her boarding house bed. Outside, the Nevada night pressed against the window of her small room above the general store in Eureka. And somewhere down the street, a dog started barking in response to her cry. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to force away the images that haunted her every time she closed them. The fire, the smoke. Her parents' faces as the flames consumed their homestead 3 months ago, while she had been away visiting her aunt in Carson City. Grace sat up and wrapped her arms around her knees, rocking slightly as she tried to calm her racing heart. This was the 4th night in a row that Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house, had complained about the screaming. The older woman had been kind enough when Grace first arrived in Eureka, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small inheritance her aunt had pressed into her hands. But patience wore thin when sleep was disturbed night after night. Grace knew she could not keep this up much longer. The other boarders were starting to talk, and in a mining town like Eureka in the summer of 1876, a young woman's reputation was fragile as spun glass. She lit the oil lamp beside her bed with trembling hands and checked the small watch that had belonged to her mother. 3 in the morning, too early to rise but too afraid to sleep again. She sat in the flickering light and tried to read from the Bible her aunt had given her. The words swam before her eyes, offering no comfort. She was 20 years old and completely alone in the world, working as a clerk in the general store for barely enough to cover her room and board, and slowly losing her mind from lack of sleep. When dawn finally broke over the high desert mountains surrounding Eureka, Grace dressed in her simple gray work dress and pinned her dark blonde hair into a severe bun. Her reflection in the small mirror showed dark circles under her green eyes and a pallor to her skin that no amount of pinching could remedy. She looked like a ghost, and she felt like one too, drifting through days in a haze of exhaustion. The general store opened at 7, and Grace was always early, preferring the quiet of the empty shop to the knowing looks of the other boarders at breakfast. Mr. Caldwell, who owned the store, was a gruff but fair man who asked few questions and paid on time. He nodded to her as he unlocked the door, his weathered face creasing in concern. "You look poorly, Miss Owens," he said, not unkindly. "You getting enough sleep?" Grace forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "I am well enough, Mr. Caldwell. Thank you for your concern." He grunted, clearly not believing her, but he did not press the matter. The morning passed in a blur of customers needing everything from flour to ammunition, miners coming down from the hills to stock up before heading back to their claims. Grace moved through the transactions mechanically, making change and wrapping purchases in brown paper, her mind fuzzy with fatigue. It was near noon when the bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in who made Grace look up despite her exhaustion. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was bronzed from years in the mountain sun. He wore buckskin trousers and a heavy canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. A large knife hung from his belt, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who feared nothing in this world. "Can I help you?" Grace asked, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. The man's eyes, which were a striking pale blue against his tanned face, took her in with one quick glance before he nodded. "Need supplies. Heading back up to my cabin for the winter. Going to need quite a bit." His voice was deep and rough, like gravel sliding down a mountainside, but there was no threat in it. Grace pulled out the order book and a pencil. "What will you be needing?" For the next 20 minutes, the man listed items with the precision of someone who knew exactly how much he needed to survive months alone in the high country. Flour, sugar, salt, coffee, dried beans, rice, cured bacon, ammunition for his rifle and pistol, lamp oil, matches, needles and thread, and a dozen other necessities. Grace wrote it all down, her hand cramping as she tried to keep up. "That is quite a list," she said when he finally stopped. "Will you be taking it all today? Can you have it ready by tomorrow morning? I have some other business in town today." "Of course. May I have your name for the order?" "Ezra Zimmerman." Grace wrote it at the top of the page, in careful letters. "And will you be paying now or upon pickup, Mr. Zimmerman?" He pulled a leather pouch from his belt and counted out gold coins onto the counter, the sound of metal on wood sharp in the quiet store. It was more than enough to cover the order. "Now," he said simply. As Grace made change from the till, she felt his eyes on her. It was not the leering stare she sometimes got from miners who had been in the hills too long, but something different, assessing perhaps, or merely curious. When she looked up, he was studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You look like you have not slept in a month," he said bluntly. Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am quite well, thank you." "Did not say you were not. Said you looked like you have not slept." There was something in his directness that made lying feel pointless. Grace glanced toward the back room where Mr. Caldwell was unpacking a shipment, then met Ezra Zimmerman's pale eyes. "I have trouble sleeping, but it is nothing that concerns you, Mr. Zimmerman." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I will be back tomorrow morning for the supplies." After he left, the store seemed smaller somehow, as if his presence had expanded to fill every corner and his absence left a vacuum. Grace shook her head at her own fancy and went to tell Mr. Caldwell about the large order they needed to fill. That night, the nightmare was worse than ever. Grace found herself trapped in her childhood home, flames licking up the walls as she ran from room to room, searching for her parents. She could hear them calling for her, but she could not find them, and the smoke grew thicker and thicker until she could not breathe. She woke gasping and sobbing, her nightgown soaked through with sweat. The pounding on her door made her jump. "Miss Owens!" It was Mrs. Henderson, and she sounded furious. "This is the last time. I will not have you disturbing my entire house night after night. You have until the end of the week to find other accommodations." Grace pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle another sob. 3 days. She had 3 days to find somewhere else to live, in a town where rooms were scarce and expensive. She sat in the darkness, too tired even to cry properly, and watched the night slowly give way to gray dawn. When Ezra Zimmerman came to collect his supplies the next morning, Grace was helping Mr. Caldwell load everything into crates. The mountain man arrived with a sturdy pack mule and immediately began lifting the heavy boxes as if they weighed nothing. Grace watched the muscles in his arms and back flex as he worked, efficient and unhurried. "You look worse than yesterday," Ezra said as he secured the last crate to the mule's pack saddle. "Thank you for that observation," Grace said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Ezra straightened and looked at her for a long moment. "You are not sleeping at all, are you?" "That is none of your business, Mr. Zimmerman." "No, it is not," he agreed. "But I know the look of someone being eaten alive from the inside. I have seen it in men after battles, the kind that does not get better on its own." Grace felt something crack inside her chest. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or maybe it was the simple fact that someone had actually seen her suffering instead of just being inconvenienced by it. But tears suddenly blurred her vision. She turned away quickly, pretending to straighten some items on a nearby shelf. "I have nightmares," she heard herself say. "Every night. About the fire that killed my parents. I cannot make them stop, and now I am being evicted from my boarding house because I wake everyone with my screaming." She did not know why she was telling this enormous stranger her troubles. Perhaps because he was leaving and it did not matter. Perhaps because she was so tired that she had no defenses left. "When did they die?" Ezra asked quietly. 3 months ago. I was not there. I was visiting my aunt in Carson City, and when I got the telegram..." She could not finish the sentence. There was a long silence. Then Ezra said something that made no sense at all. "Come with me." Grace turned to stare at him. "What?" "Come with me, up to my cabin, stay the winter." "I do not..." "That is not... Mr. Zimmerman. That would be completely inappropriate." "Probably," he agreed, unfazed. "But you need to sleep, and you cannot do it here. My cabin is 3 days' ride into the mountains. It is quiet there. No one to disturb or be disturbed by. You can scream all you want, and only the trees will hear." "You are suggesting I go alone into the wilderness with a man I do not know?" Grace felt like she was going mad. "Why would you even suggest such a thing?" Ezra was quiet for a moment, his pale eyes distant. "I had a sister once, younger than me. She got the same look you have now after some Paiute raiders hit our homestead when I was off hunting. She would not sleep, would not eat. Wasted away to nothing in 6 months because no one knew how to help her. I will not watch it happen to someone else if I can prevent it." The raw pain in his voice was unmistakable. Grace found her anger draining away, replaced by something she could not quite name. "I am sorry about your sister, Mr. Zimmerman. Truly. But I cannot just leave. I have a job. I have responsibilities." "You have a job that barely pays enough to live on and a room you are being kicked out of in 3 days. What responsibilities are keeping you here?" Grace opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was right. She had no one and nothing holding her to Eureka. No friends, no family within 200 miles, no prospects for anything better. And she was so tired, she could barely think straight anymore. "I do not understand why you would do this," she said finally. "Take in a complete stranger." "I live alone in the mountains 8 months of the year," Ezra said. "I am used to my own company, but I am not opposed to someone else being around, especially if they need help. And I am no threat to you, Miss Owens. I am offering you a place to sleep and time to heal, nothing more." "People would talk," Grace said weakly. "We will be miles from anyone who could talk, and when spring comes, if you want to return to town, I will bring you back. No one needs to know where you spent the winter." Grace looked at this strange, blunt mountain man who was offering her something she desperately needed but should not accept. Every rule of propriety she had ever been taught screamed at her to refuse. But those rules had been made for a world where she still had parents and a home and a future that made sense. That world had burned to ash 3 months ago. "I would need to give Mr. Caldwell notice," she said slowly, hardly believing the words coming from her mouth. "I can wait 2 days," Ezra said. "No more than that. Winter comes early in the high country, and I need to be back before the first snows." That evening, Grace gave her notice to a surprised but understanding Mr. Caldwell. "I need to leave town for a while," she told him, not quite meeting his eyes. "For my health." If he suspected where she was really going, he did not say. He paid her what he owed and added a little extra. "You have been a good worker, Miss Owens. I hope you find what you are looking for." Telling Mrs. Henderson was easier, since the woman was clearly relieved to be rid of her troublesome boarder. Grace packed her few belongings into a small carpet bag and spent her last night in Eureka staring at the ceiling. Too anxious and uncertain to sleep, even if the nightmares had allowed it. When dawn came, she dressed in her most practical dress and the sturdy boots she had bought with part of her mother's money. She met Ezra outside the general store where he was waiting with his pack mule and a gentle mare that he said would be hers to ride. "Her name is Clover," he said, holding the mare's reins out to Grace. "She is old but steady, will not spook easily." Grace took the reins with shaking hands. She had ridden a little as a child, but not much, and never on a journey that would last days. Ezra must have seen her nervousness, because he spent a few minutes showing her how to sit properly and how to hold the reins to guide the mare. "We will take it slow," he said. "Clover knows the way. Just let her follow my horse and the mule." They left Eureka as the sun was rising over the Ruby Mountains to the east, painting the high desert in shades of gold and amber. Grace looked back once at the small town that had been her refuge and prison for 3 months, then turned her face forward toward the unknown. The first day of riding was harder than Grace had imagined. Her legs and back ached within the first few hours, and the sun beat down mercilessly despite it being early September. Ezra set a steady but not punishing pace, stopping regularly to let the animals rest and for them to drink from the canteens he had filled. He did not talk much, which Grace found she appreciated. She was too focused on staying in the saddle and too uncertain about her decision to make conversation. They stopped for a brief noon meal of hard bread and dried meat, eaten in the shade of a rocky outcrop. Ezra studied the mountains ahead, his eyes scanning the terrain with the practiced ease of someone who knew this land intimately. "We will make camp near a creek I know in a few hours," he said. "Good water and shelter from the wind." "How much further to your cabin?" Grace asked. 2 more days at this pace. Could do it faster, but no need to push the animals or you. You are not used to riding. Grace wanted to protest that she was fine, but her aching muscles made a liar of her. Instead, she nodded and focused on finishing her meal. The campsite Ezra chose that evening was in a small grove of juniper trees near a clear running creek. He unsaddled the horses and unpacked the mule with quick efficiency, then set about building a fire and making camp. Grace tried to help, but she was so sore and stiff from the day's ride that she moved clumsily. "Sit," Ezra said not unkindly. "You are not used to this. I will handle it tonight. Tomorrow you can help more." Too exhausted to argue, Grace sat on a flat rock near the fire and watched him work. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, setting up a small canvas shelter for her to sleep under, laying out bedrolls and putting coffee on to boil. Within half an hour, he had a simple but filling meal of beans and bacon ready. They ate in silence as darkness fell over the mountains. The sky filled with more stars than Grace had ever seen in her life. A vast, sparkling blanket that seemed close enough to touch. The creek burbled nearby, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. "You should sleep," Ezra said, after they had finished eating and he had cleaned the dishes in the creek. "Long day tomorrow." Grace looked at the bedroll under the canvas shelter and felt her chest tighten with anxiety. "I will try. When the nightmare comes, I will be right here," Ezra said, gesturing to his own bedroll positioned a respectful distance away near the fire. "You will be safe." It was such a simple statement, but something in Grace's chest loosened slightly. She nodded and crawled into her bedroll, still fully dressed except for her boots. The exhaustion from the day's ride pulled at her immediately, and despite her fear, she felt herself sinking towards sleep. The nightmare came, as it always did. The fire, the smoke, the screaming. Grace thrashed in her bedroll, whimpering, then crying out as the flames consumed everything. She woke to find strong hands on her shoulders, shaking her gently but firmly. "Miss Owens, Grace, wake up. You are safe. It is just a dream." Grace's eyes flew open to see Ezra kneeling beside her bedroll, his face illuminated by the dying firelight. She was sobbing, she realized, great, gasping sobs that tore from her throat. "I am sorry," she managed to choke out. "I am so sorry." "Nothing to be sorry for," Ezra said. His hands were still on her shoulders, solid and warm. "Do you want to talk about it?" "It is always the same," Grace whispered. "The fire. I can hear them calling for me, but I cannot find them. I cannot save them." Ezra was quiet for a moment. Then, very carefully, he asked, "May I sit with you? Sometimes it helps to have someone nearby." Grace nodded, too wrung out to care about propriety anymore. Ezra settled himself on the ground beside her bedroll, his back against a rock. "Try to sleep again," he said. "I will be right here." "You need to sleep too," Grace protested weakly. "I will, but I am used to light sleeping in the mountains. Any unusual sound wakes me, including nightmares. Now rest." Grace lay back down, intensely aware of the large, solid presence beside her. It should have made her nervous, being so close to a man she barely knew. But instead, she felt safer than she had in months. When she drifted off again, the nightmare tried to return. But this time when she whimpered, Ezra's deep voice cut through the dream. "You are safe, Grace. It is just a dream. I am here." The sound of his voice pulled her back from the edge of terror. And though she did not fully wake, the nightmare lost its grip. She slept fitfully but without screaming for the rest of the night. And when dawn came, she woke to find Ezra already up and making coffee, as if he had not spent half the night keeping watch over her. They did not speak of it as they broke camp and started riding again. But something had shifted between them. Grace found herself watching Ezra as they rode, taking in the way he sat his horse with easy grace despite his size. The way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings. The quiet competence with which he handled everything. The second day's ride took them higher into the mountains. The desert gave way to scattered pines and then to thicker forest. The air grew cooler and carried the sharp, clean scent of evergreen and stone. Grace's muscles were still sore, but she was adjusting to the rhythm of riding, and she found herself actually enjoying the journey despite her exhaustion and uncertainty. They stopped for the noon meal beside a small waterfall that tumbled down a granite face in a cascade of white water. Ezra led the horses to drink, while Grace sat on a sun-warmed boulder and let the spray from the falls cool her heated skin. "It is beautiful here," she said when Ezra returned with their provisions. "It is," he agreed. "This is why I stay in the mountains. Down in the towns, everything is crowded and loud. Up here, there is room to breathe." "Do you ever get lonely?" Ezra considered the question as he handed her some dried fruit and jerky. "Sometimes. But I prefer loneliness to bad company, and most people are bad company in one way or another. Not their fault, usually. Just the way of things." "Am I bad company?" Grace asked, surprising herself with the question. Ezra's pale eyes met hers, and she thought she saw a hint of a smile at the corner of his mouth. "You have barely said a dozen words in 2 days. But no, you are not bad company. You are quiet, and I like quiet." They made camp that night in a meadow surrounded by tall pines. The grass was thick and green, fed by an underground spring that bubbled up in one corner. It felt almost magical in the fading light, and Grace found herself relaxing in a way she had not in months. The nightmare came again that night. But as before, Ezra was there. This time, instead of just sitting beside her bedroll, he reached out and took her hand when she started to whimper. "You are safe," he said firmly. "Feel my hand? You are here with me in the mountains. The fire is gone. You are safe." His hand was enormous and calloused and warm, and Grace clung to it like a lifeline. The nightmare receded, pushed back by the solid reality of his presence. She did not pull her hand away when the dream faded, and he did not let go. They stayed like that until she fell back asleep, his hand holding hers in the darkness. In the morning, neither of them mentioned it. The third day's ride was shorter, and by mid-afternoon, they emerged into a clearing where a sturdy log cabin stood with its back to a steep rock face. It was larger than Grace had expected, with a covered porch and a stone chimney rising from the roof. A small barn stood nearby, and a creek ran along one side of the clearing. "Welcome home," Ezra said simply. Grace slid down from Clover's back and looked around. The clearing was beautiful, surrounded by pine forest with mountains rising in every direction. The cabin looked solid and well-built, and the whole place had an air of peaceful isolation that made something in Grace's chest unclench. "It is wonderful," she said honestly. Ezra nodded, clearly pleased. "Come on, let me show you inside. Then I will get the animals settled." The inside of the cabin was simple but comfortable. One large main room held a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, shelves stocked with supplies, and a narrow bed in one corner. A ladder led up to a small loft space under the roof. "You take the bed down here," Ezra said. "I sleep in the loft usually. More private for both of us that way." Grace looked at the solid, well-made bed with its thick blankets and felt a rush of gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Zimmerman, for all of this." "Call me Ezra," he said. "No need for formality when we are going to be spending the winter together. And you are welcome. Now, I need to get the animals taken care of before dark. Make yourself at home. There's a pump out back for fresh water if you want to wash up." He left her alone in the cabin, and Grace took the opportunity to explore more thoroughly. Everything was neat and organized, with a place for everything. There were books on a shelf which surprised her, and she pulled one down to find it was a collection of Ralph Waldo Emerson's essays. Others included volumes of poetry, natural history, and even a novel by Charles Dickens. Whoever Ezra Zimmerman was, he was not the uneducated mountain hermit she might have expected. That evening, Ezra cooked a proper meal using fresh supplies he had stored in the small root cellar behind the cabin. They ate venison stew with wild onions and herbs, and bread he had baked in the fireplace oven. It was the best meal Grace had eaten since leaving her parents' home, and she told him so. "Learn to cook out of necessity," Ezra said. "A man gets tired of burned meat and half-cooked beans pretty quick." After dinner, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The night sounds of the forest surrounded them, and Grace felt more at peace than she had in months. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for bringing me here, for helping me." "We will see if it helps," Ezra said. "Give it time." When full darkness fell, they went inside, and Ezra banked the fire for the night. He climbed up to the loft, while Grace changed into her nightgown behind a blanket he had strung up to give her privacy. She crawled into the bed and was surprised by how comfortable it was, the mattress stuffed with something soft and sweet-smelling. "Pine needles and dried grass," Ezra called down from the loft, apparently hearing her movement. "More comfortable than you would think." Grace settled in and closed her eyes, bracing herself for the nightmare. It came, as always, but this time when she cried out, she heard Ezra moving immediately. He climbed down from the loft and was beside her bed in seconds. "Grace," he said firmly, "wake up. You're safe." She woke with a gasp, tears streaming down her face. Ezra stood beside the bed, his hair loose around his shoulders, wearing only his trousers. "I am sorry," Grace whispered. "I thought maybe here it would be different." "It has only been one night," Ezra said. "These things take time." He pulled the rocking chair from near the fireplace over to beside her bed and sat down. "Go back to sleep. I will stay here." "You cannot sleep in a chair all night," Grace protested. "I have slept in worse places. Go on, try again." Too tired to argue, Grace lay back down. Having Ezra so close, keeping watch, made her feel safer than she had since her parents died. When she drifted off again and the nightmare began to creep back, his deep voice cut through it. "I have you. You are safe." The nightmare retreated, and Grace slept. This became their pattern. Each night the nightmare would come, and each night Ezra would be there. Sometimes he sat in the chair beside her bed. Sometimes, when the nightmare was particularly bad, he would sit on the edge of the bed and hold her hand until she calmed. Always, his presence pushed the terror back. The days fell into a rhythm as well. Ezra had work to do preparing the cabin and his supplies for winter, and Grace helped where she could. She learned to chop wood, though her pieces were rough and uneven compared to Ezra's perfectly split logs. She helped him repair the barn roof and spent hours preserving the last of the summer vegetables he had growing in a small garden patch. They talked more as the days passed. Grace learned that Ezra was 32 years old and had come west after the war, looking for solitude after the horrors he had seen. He had spent time as a scout and a trapper before building this cabin 5 years ago. He lived off the land most of the year, going to town only when he needed supplies he could not make or hunt himself. Grace told him about her childhood on the homestead near Virginia City, about her dreams of becoming a teacher before her parents died, about the guilt that ate at her for not being there when they needed her. "You could not have saved them even if you had been there," Ezra said bluntly one afternoon as they worked together to stack firewood. "You would have just died with them. Your aunt was right to keep you away that day." "But I should have been there," Grace insisted, her eyes burning with tears. "They died alone and afraid." "They died knowing you were safe," Ezra countered. "That would have been a comfort." Grace wanted to argue, but something in his certainty made her stop. He spoke as someone who had seen death, who understood it in a way she did not yet. 2 weeks passed, then 3. The nights grew colder, and the leaves on the aspens surrounding the clearing turned gold and then began to fall. The nightmares continued, but they were changing. Grace still dreamed of fire, but now sometimes Ezra's voice was in the dream, pulling her back. Sometimes she dreamed she could hear him telling her she was safe, and the flames would retreat. One morning, Grace woke to find frost on the ground and snow dusting the highest peaks visible from the cabin clearing. Ezra was already up, building up the fire and making coffee. "Winter is coming," he said when he saw she was awake. "We will likely see our first real snow within a week." The thought should have frightened Grace, the idea of being snowed in for months with nowhere to go. But instead she felt oddly peaceful about it. This cabin in the mountains had become a sanctuary, and Ezra had become something she could not quite name. More than a friend, though they had never been anything but proper with each other. A protector, certainly, but also someone she was coming to trust in a way she had never trusted anyone. That night, the nightmare was worse than it had been in days. Grace dreamed not just of the fire, but of Ezra being in the fire too, of losing him the way she had lost her parents. She woke screaming his name, thrashing in the tangled blankets. Ezra was there instantly, as always. "I am here," he said urgently. "Grace, I am right here. I am safe. You are safe." But Grace could not stop crying. The fear of losing him, which she had not even realized she carried, overwhelmed her. Without thinking, she reached for him, and he caught her hands in his. "I am here," he repeated. "I am not going anywhere." "I cannot lose you too," Grace gasped out between sobs. "I cannot." Ezra went very still. In the dim light from the banked fire, his pale eyes searched her face. "You will not lose me," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "I promise you that." "You cannot promise that. No one can." "I am promising it anyway." He squeezed her hands gently. "I am not going anywhere, Grace. Not unless you tell me to go." Something in his words, in the intensity of his gaze, made Grace's breath catch. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither of them had acknowledged until this moment. "Ezra," she whispered. He reached up with one hand and gently brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. The touch was feather light, but it sent warmth spreading through Grace's chest. "You should rest," he said quietly, but he did not move away. "Stay," Grace said. "Not in the chair. Stay here, please." It was bold, perhaps even scandalous. But Grace was past caring. All she knew was that she felt safe when he was close, and she needed that safety more than she needed to preserve some abstract sense of propriety. Ezra hesitated for a long moment, clearly torn. Then he nodded slowly. "I will stay, but I will sleep on top of the blankets. I will not compromise you, Grace." He moved to lie down beside her on the bed, carefully staying on top of the quilt while she was beneath it. There was easily a foot of space between them, proper and chaste, but Grace could feel the warmth radiating from his large frame. "Thank you," she whispered. "Sleep," he said gently. "I have you." Grace closed her eyes and for the first time in months felt truly safe. When she drifted off, no nightmare came. Her sleep was deep and dreamless. And when she woke in the early morning light, Ezra was still there, his hand resting on the quilt near hers, as if even in sleep he was keeping watch. Things shifted between them after that night. Ezra continued to sleep beside her on top of the blankets, and the nightmares came less frequently. When they did come, he was right there, his solid presence and calm voice pulling her back from the terror. But more than that, Grace began to realize what she had been afraid to acknowledge before. She was falling in love with this quiet, strong mountain man who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. She loved the way he moved, all controlled power and grace despite his size. She loved his dry sense of humor and the way he seemed to understand her without needing many words. She loved how safe she felt with him, how he never made her feel weak or broken, even when she woke screaming. The first snow came in mid-October, a light dusting that made the clearing look like something from a fairy tale. Grace stood on the porch wrapped in a shawl Ezra had given her and watched the flakes fall in the early morning light. "Beautiful, is it not?" Ezra's voice came from behind her, and she turned to see him carrying an armload of firewood. "It is," she agreed, "though I confess I am glad to be watching it from a warm, dry cabin." "That is the secret of winter," Ezra said as he carried the wood inside. "Being prepared for it. Then you can enjoy it instead of fear it." Over the following weeks, winter settled in earnest over the mountains. The snow grew deeper, and the temperature dropped until frost coated the inside of the windows each morning. But inside the cabin, Grace was warm and, to her surprise, happy. She and Ezra had fallen into an easy domesticity. She cooked meals while he took care of the animals and brought in firewood. They spent the long evenings reading aloud to each other, playing chess on a board Ezra had carved himself, or simply sitting in companionable silence. And each night, Ezra slept beside her on the bed, still carefully on top of the blankets, his presence keeping the nightmares at bay. It was nearly Thanksgiving when Grace realized she had gone 3 nights in a row without a nightmare. She woke on the 4th morning to find pale sunlight streaming through the window and Ezra already up, making breakfast. "I did not have a nightmare last night," she said, sitting up in bed. Ezra turned from the stove, a hint of a smile on his weathered face. "I know. You slept peacefully all night." "That is 3 nights now," Grace said, hardly daring to believe it. "You are healing," Ezra said simply. "Slowly, but you are healing." Grace got up and went to the small mirror that hung near the wash basin. The face that looked back at her was different from the one she had seen in Eureka 2 months ago. The dark circles under her eyes had faded. Her cheeks had filled out from Ezra's good cooking. She looked healthy and rested, not like a ghost anymore. She turned to find Ezra watching her, his pale eyes intense. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything you have done for me. I do not think I would have survived without you." "You are stronger than you think," Ezra said, "but I am glad I could help." Grace crossed the small space between them, her heart pounding. "Ezra, I need to tell you something." He set down the spatula he had been holding and gave her his full attention. "What is it?" Grace took a deep breath. "I have been here nearly 2 months now, and in that time, you have shown me more kindness than I have any right to expect. You have kept me safe, held me through my nightmares, and never asked for anything in return. And I have come to realize that She paused, gathering her courage. "I have feelings for you. Deep feelings. I know I have no right to burden you with this, but I could not keep it to myself any longer." Ezra was very still, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them until Grace felt her face flush with embarrassment. "I apologize," she said quickly. "I should not have said anything. You have been nothing but a gentleman, and I am abusing your hospitality by—" "Grace." Ezra's voice cut through her babbling. He reached out and took both of her hands in his. "You are not abusing anything, and you are not alone in your feelings." Grace's breath caught. "What?" "I have been half in love with you since I saw you in that general store looking like you were about to collapse," Ezra said roughly. "And I have been all the way in love with you since about the 2nd week you have been here. But I did not say anything because I did not want to take advantage. You came here because you needed help, not because you wanted a husband." "But I do want a husband," Grace said, her voice trembling. "If that husband is you." Ezra's hands tightened on hers. "Are you certain?" "I am not an easy man, Grace. I live in the middle of nowhere. I do not have much to offer except this cabin and my word that I will do everything in my power to keep you safe and happy." "That is more than enough," Grace said. "More than I ever hoped for. I love you, Ezra. I love your strength and your kindness. I love how safe I feel with you. I love this life we have been building together these past weeks. I do not want to go back to town in the spring. I want to stay here with you." For answer, Ezra pulled her into his arms. He was so much larger than her that she felt completely enveloped, surrounded by warmth and strength. His hand came up to cup the back of her head, holding her gently against his chest. "I love you too," he said, his deep voice rumbling through his chest. "More than I have the words to say." Grace pulled back enough to look up at his face. His pale eyes were blazing with emotion, and before she could second-guess herself, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but then Ezra made a low sound in his chest and deepened it, one hand cupping her face while the other wrapped around her waist. Grace had been kissed before, chased pecks from a boy in Virginia City years ago, but nothing had prepared her for this. This was heat and need and homecoming all wrapped into one. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ezra rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "Soon as the snows let up enough for us to get to a preacher. I want to do this right, Grace. I want you to be my wife in truth, not just in practice." "Yes," Grace said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you." That night, Ezra still slept on top of the blankets, though they both knew it was more difficult now. They lay facing each other in the darkness, holding hands, talking quietly about the future. "We will need to add on to the cabin," Ezra said. "Make more room, maybe build a proper bedroom instead of using the main room." "And I want to plant a real garden in the spring," Grace said. "A big one, and maybe we could get some chickens." "Chickens I can do," Ezra agreed. "And we will need to ride into Eureka to get you a proper wedding dress. I want to see you in a dress that is not worn and mended." Grace laughed softly. "I do not need fancy things, Ezra. I just need you." "You deserve fancy things," he said firmly. "You deserve everything I can give you. It is not much, but it is yours." They talked until the fire burned low and sleep began to pull at them. For the first time, Grace drifted off without any fear of what dreams might come. And when she slept, there were no nightmares. There was only peace and the warmth of Ezra's hand in hers. Winter deepened around the cabin. The snow piled higher and higher until it reached the bottom of the windows. Ezra had to dig paths from the cabin to the barn and the root cellar, creating tunnels through the snow. But inside, Grace and Ezra created their own world, one of warmth and laughter and growing love. Grace had not had another nightmare in 2 weeks. She slept peacefully now, secure in Ezra's presence. During the days, she took over more of the household tasks, learning to bake bread in the fireplace oven and to make soap from rendered fat. She mended their clothes and even started a quilt using scraps of fabric Ezra had stored away. Ezra taught her to snowshoe, and on clear days, they would venture out into the winter forest together. He showed her how to read animal tracks in the snow and how to tell which trees were safe to tap for sap when spring came. Grace felt herself growing stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. The grief over her parents' death would always be there, but it no longer consumed her. She could remember them now with love, instead of just pain. As December arrived and Christmas approached, Grace and Ezra talked seriously about their wedding plans. "The snow will not clear enough to get to town until late February at the earliest," Ezra said one evening as they sat by the fire. "Maybe even March. Can you wait that long?" "I would wait forever if I had to," Grace said honestly. "But I confess I am impatient to truly be your wife." Ezra's eyes darkened at that, and he reached out to pull her into his lap in the rocking chair where he sat. It had become their habit in recent weeks. Grace curled up against his broad chest while they talked or read. "I am impatient too," he admitted, his voice rough. "More than you know." Grace turned her face up to kiss him, and the kiss quickly grew heated. Ezra's hands tightened on her waist, then moved to cup her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "We should stop," he said when they broke apart, both breathing hard. "I know," Grace whispered. But she did not move away. They sat like that for a long moment, desire and restraint warring in both of them. Finally, Ezra stood, lifting Grace with him as if she weighed nothing, and set her gently on her feet. "I promise to do this right," he said. "And I will keep that promise, even if it kills me." Grace touched his face, feeling the roughness of his evening beard under her palm. "You are a good man, Ezra Zimmerman." "I am trying to be," he said. "For you." Christmas came and went quietly. They had no decorations except for a small pine branch Grace had arranged with red berries, but it felt more meaningful than any fancy holiday Grace had ever experienced. Ezra had secretly carved her a beautiful wooden box with her initials on the lid, and Grace had knit him thick wool socks from yarn she had found in his supplies. "They are perfect," Ezra said, examining the socks with genuine pleasure. "My old ones were getting holes I could not mend anymore." "I will make you more," Grace promised, "and a new sweater when I have enough yarn." They spent Christmas Day playing in the snow like children, building a snowman that reached nearly as tall as Ezra. They laughed until their sides hurt, and Grace thought she had never been happier in her life. That night, as they lay together in the bed, Ezra said quietly, "I never thought I would have this. A home, someone to share it with. After the war, I thought I was too broken for any kind of normal life." "What happened in the war?" Grace asked gently. Ezra rarely spoke of his past. He was quiet for a long time. "Bad things," he said finally. "Things I do not like to remember. I was a sharpshooter, which is a polite way of saying I killed men from a distance where they could not fight back. It was necessary, or so they told us, but it does something to your soul after a while. When the war ended, I could not go back to Ohio where I grew up. Too many people, too many memories. I came west looking for space to breathe, and I found it here." Grace squeezed his hand. "I am glad you came west. Otherwise, we would never have met." "Best decision I ever made," Ezra agreed. He rolled onto his side to face her. "You have given me something I thought I lost in the war. Hope. You gave me back my life," Grace said. "I was dying slowly in Eureka, even if no one could see it. You saved me." "We saved each other," Ezra said. He kissed her forehead gently. "Now sleep. No more sad talk tonight." Grace drifted off with a smile on her face, and when she dreamed, it was of spring and wildflowers and a wedding in a small church. January and February passed in a blur of snow and domestic contentment. Grace had not had a nightmare since before Christmas, and she no longer felt the constant undercurrent of fear that had plagued her for months. She was truly healing, and she knew it was because of Ezra's steady, patient presence. In late February, they woke to find the temperature had risen above freezing for the first time in months. The snow began to melt, dripping from the cabin roof in a steady cascade. Ezra stepped outside to assess the situation and came back grinning. "Another week or two and the pass should be clear enough to risk," he said. "We can head to Eureka for supplies and to find a preacher." Grace felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. "Really? That soon?" "If the weather holds. It is still February, so we could get another storm. But I think we are past the worst of it." Grace threw her arms around him, and Ezra laughed, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around. "Careful, woman. You will bowl me over." "I am just excited," Grace said, kissing him soundly. "I am ready to be your wife." "And I am very ready for you to be my wife," Ezra agreed, setting her down. His pale eyes were serious. "You are sure about this, Grace? Once we are married, this is your life? Winters snowed in, summer and fall working to prepare for winter. Town only a few times a year. It is not an easy life." "It is the life I want." Grace said firmly. As long as it is with you. They spent the next week preparing for the trip. Ezra checked over their saddles and tack, made sure the horses were ready for the journey, and put together a list of supplies they would need for the coming year. Grace went through her small wardrobe and tried to decide what she would wear for her wedding, finally settling on her best dress, a dark green wool that brought out her eyes. The day they set out for Eureka, the sun was shining and the air smelled of melting snow and pine. The trip down the mountain was treacherous in places where the melting snow had created muddy slides, but Ezra navigated them with ease, and by the third day, they rode into Eureka. The town looked just as Grace remembered it, though it felt like a different lifetime since she had left. They stopped first at the general store where Mr. Caldwell greeted Grace with surprised pleasure. "Miss Owens, I had wondered what became of you. You are looking well." "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. I am quite well." Grace glanced at Ezra, who stood beside her with his hand resting lightly on her lower back. "In fact, Mr. Zimmerman and I are here to be married. Can you direct us to the nearest preacher?" If Mr. Caldwell was surprised, he hid it well. He congratulated them both and directed them to the small church at the end of town where Reverend Morris presided. Reverend Morris was a kind-faced man in his 50s who agreed to perform the ceremony the next day. "I assume you are in a hurry to get back to the mountains before the weather turns?" he asked Ezra. "Yes, sir. Cannot risk another storm catching us on the trail." "Then tomorrow it is. Do you have witnesses?" Grace and Ezra looked at each other, realizing they had not thought of that. Seeing their predicament, the Reverend smiled. "I can round up a few members of the congregation. There are always folks willing to witness a wedding." That night, they stayed in the same boarding house where Grace had lived before, though Mrs. Henderson was notably cooler toward her than before. Grace did not care. Tomorrow she would marry Ezra, and nothing else mattered. They stood before Reverend Morris the next afternoon in the small church. Grace wore her green dress and had managed to buy a small bouquet of dried flowers from the general store. Ezra wore his best shirt and trousers and had trimmed his hair, though it still hung past his collar. 3 townspeople Grace did not know served as witnesses. As they spoke their vows, Grace felt a sense of rightness settle over her like a benediction. This was where she was meant to be, with this man, building a life in the mountains. When Ezra slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, one he had purchased from a jeweler in town that morning, Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you," she whispered, as the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife. "I love you too," Ezra said. And then he kissed her in front of God and everyone. A deep, claiming kiss that left no doubt about his feelings. They spent their wedding night at the boarding house, and for the first time, there were no blankets between them. Ezra was gentle and patient, taking his time to make sure Grace felt safe and loved. When they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the natural culmination of everything that had been building between them since they met. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, and Ezra stroked Grace's hair with one large hand. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "Not a single one," Grace said, kissing his chest. "You?" "Only that I did not meet you sooner," Ezra said. "But I am grateful for every moment we have from here on out." They left Eureka 2 days later, loaded down with supplies and with new gold rings on their fingers. The ride back up to the cabin felt like a honeymoon, just the 2 of them and the mountains. They took their time, stopping early each day to make camp and spend long hours learning each other, talking and touching and planning their future. When they finally arrived back at the cabin, the clearing was green with early spring growth. Crocuses poked through the last patches of snow, and the aspens were beginning to bud. "Welcome home, Mrs. Zimmerman," Ezra said as he helped Grace down from her horse. Grace looked at the cabin, at the mountains beyond, at the creek rushing with snow melt. Then she looked at her husband, this strong, gentle man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Home," she agreed. "Let us go inside." That night, they lay together in their bed, properly married now, and Grace marveled at how much her life had changed in 6 months. She had gone from being a broken, terrified woman, screaming herself awake every night, to this, safe, loved, and utterly at peace. "I have not had a nightmare in 3 months," she said softly. Ezra's arms tightened around her. "And you will not have them again. You are healed, Grace, whole again." "Because of you," she said. "You held me through them all until they stopped." "We held each other," Ezra corrected. "You gave me something to care about again, something to protect. You healed me too, in ways you do not even realize." Grace turned in his arms to face him. "Then we are both lucky. More than lucky. Blessed." They kissed, and it led to more. And when Grace finally drifted off to sleep hours later, it was with Ezra's arms around her and a smile on her face. She slept deeply and dreamlessly, secure in the knowledge that she would wake in the morning to the man she loved and the life they were building together. Spring turned to summer, and Grace threw herself into making the cabin a true home. She planted her garden, filling it with vegetables and herbs, and Ezra built her a chicken coop. They acquired 6 hens who provided fresh eggs and endless entertainment with their antics. True to his word, Ezra began expanding the cabin. He added a proper bedroom separate from the main living space, with a real door for privacy and a window that looked out over the creek. Grace sewed curtains for all the windows from fabric they had bought in Eureka, and she arranged their few belongings to make the space as comfortable as possible. In June, Grace realized she had not bled in 2 months. When she mentioned it to Ezra, his eyes went wide, then blazed with fierce joy. "A baby?" he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think so," Grace said, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. "Are you happy?" For answer, Ezra picked her up and spun her around, laughing like Grace had never heard him laugh before. "Happy? I am over the moon, Grace. A child. Our child." He set her down gently, suddenly cautious. "Are you feeling well? Do you need to rest? Maybe you should not be doing so much work in the garden." Grace laughed at his sudden protectiveness. "I am fine, Ezra. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am healthy and strong, and I will not break." But Ezra fussed over her anyway, insisting she take rests during the day and making sure she ate plenty. Grace found his concern endearing, even when it bordered on excessive. As summer progressed and Grace's belly began to swell, they made preparations for the baby's arrival. Ezra carved a beautiful cradle from pine and lined it with soft furs. Grace sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her heart full of anticipation and just a little fear. "What if I am not a good mother?" she asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. "You will be a wonderful mother," Ezra said firmly. "You have more love in you than anyone I have ever met. Our child will be lucky to have you." "And lucky to have you as a father," Grace said. "You are so good with the animals, so patient. You will be the same with our baby." The baby arrived in early February, during a snowstorm, as if determined to make an entrance. Grace's labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Ezra looked terrified, but he stayed beside her the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally emerged, squalling and red-faced, Ezra caught him with steady hands and wrapped him in a soft blanket Grace had made. "A boy," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "We have a son, Grace." He placed the baby in Grace's arms, and she looked down at the tiny face, the dark hair already thick on his head, the small fists waving. Love crashed over her like a wave, so powerful it took her breath away. "He is perfect," she whispered. "He is," Ezra agreed, kissing her forehead. "You did so well, Grace. I am so proud of you." They named him Samuel, after Ezra's father, and he became the center of their world. Ezra proved to be as patient and gentle with his son as Grace had known he would be, rocking him to sleep and changing diapers without complaint. Watching Ezra with their baby made Grace fall even more deeply in love with her husband. The nightmares never returned. Grace slept soundly each night, sometimes waking to nurse Samuel but always falling back asleep easily, secure in the knowledge that she was safe and loved. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Clara, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's pale blue eyes. She was a sunny, happy baby who rarely cried and seemed to find joy in everything. Their life was not easy. Winters were still harsh, supplies sometimes ran low, and there were moments of sickness and worry. But through it all, Grace and Ezra faced everything together, their love growing stronger with each passing year. On their 5th anniversary, they stood on the porch of their expanded cabin, now with 3 bedrooms and a proper kitchen. Samuel was playing in the yard with a wooden horse Ezra had carved for him, while baby Clara napped inside. "Do you ever regret it?" Ezra asked, his arm around Grace's waist. "Choosing this life? You could have gone back to civilization, found an easier path." Grace turned to look at her husband. He was older now, his dark hair showing threads of silver, but he was still the strong, protective man who had saved her life that day in the general store. "Never," she said firmly. "This is exactly the life I was meant to live. Here in these mountains with you and our children. I could not imagine anything better." Ezra kissed her, long and deep, and when they pulled apart, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "I love you," he said simply. "I love you too," Grace replied. "Thank you for holding me through the nightmares until they stopped. Thank you for giving me a reason to heal." "Thank you for healing," Ezra said. "Thank you for choosing to stay, for building this life with me. You and our children are everything I never knew I needed." They stood together as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, an eagle called, and the creek sang its endless song. Grace leaned against her husband's solid warmth and smiled. She had traveled through fire and grief to find this place, this man, this life. The nightmares that had once consumed her were nothing but distant memory now, pushed away by years of love and safety and belonging. She was home, truly and completely home, and nothing would ever take that from her. Inside, Clara began to cry, and Samuel called for his mother. Grace kissed Ezra once more, then went inside to tend to her children, her heart full to bursting with gratitude for the mountain man who had held her through her darkest nights and loved her into the light. The years continued to pass peacefully in their mountain home. Samuel grew into a strong, curious boy who followed his father everywhere, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness. Clara became a chatterbox who filled the cabin with laughter and endless questions about everything she saw. When Samuel was 7 and Clara was 5, Grace found herself pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body knowing what to do. She gave birth on a warm summer afternoon to twin boys they named James and Thomas. Ezra was beside himself with joy and terror in equal measure, staring at the two identical babies as if he could not quite believe they were real. 4 children, he said wonderingly. We have 4 children, Grace. We certainly do. Grace laughed, exhausted but happy. I hope you are ready for even less sleep than we were already getting. But they managed, as they always did. The twins were surprisingly easy babies, content to lie together in the cradle Ezra had made for Samuel years ago. Clara was delighted to have baby brothers and spent hours singing to them and bringing them flowers she picked in the meadow. The cabin expanded again, with Ezra adding another room for the boys to share. He built more furniture, carved more toys, and somehow found time to keep them all fed and safe through another winter. Grace's days were full of cooking and cleaning and tending children, but she had never been happier. Sometimes she would stop in the middle of her work and just look around at her life, at the home she and Ezra had built, at the children they had created together. It seemed impossible that this was real, that she had gone from that broken, terrified girl screaming herself awake every night to this strong woman with a family and a home. One night when the twins were about 6 months old, Grace woke suddenly from a deep sleep. For a moment, she felt a flicker of old fear, that sensation of something being wrong. Then she realized what had woken her was not a nightmare, but simply the need to check on the babies. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Ezra, and went to the twins' cradle. They were both sleeping peacefully, their tiny faces relaxed and content. Grace stood watching them, her hand on her chest, where her heart beat steady and calm. No nightmare, no terror, just a mother checking on her children. Grace? Ezra's sleepy voice came from the bedroom. You all right? She went back to him, crawling into their bed and into his arms. I am perfect, she said softly. I just realized I woke up from sleep without any fear at all. It has been so long since the nightmares that I had almost forgotten they ever existed. Ezra's arms tightened around her. You are healed, he said simply. Completely healed. Thanks to you, Grace said. You held me through every single nightmare until they stopped. You gave me a safe place to heal. We healed each other, Ezra said, as he always did. I was as broken as you when we met, just in different ways. You gave me a reason to come back to the world. They lay together in the darkness, listening to the familiar night sounds of their home, the twins breathing softly in their cradle, the wind in the pines outside, the creak of the cabin settling, all the sounds of a life well lived and fully embraced. As the years passed, the children grew. Samuel became a skilled hunter and tracker like his father, though he also showed his mother's love of books and learning. Clara developed a talent for drawing and would spend hours sketching the wildlife around their cabin. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and getting into mischief together that neither would have attempted alone. When Samuel was 12, Ezra began teaching him to take over some of the responsibility for the family. Not because Ezra was slowing down, but because he wanted his son to be prepared for any eventuality. Grace watched father and son working together, their heads bent over a map of trap lines or a rifle that needed cleaning, and her heart swelled with pride and love. One spring day when Grace was 35 years old, she and Ezra took a rare afternoon away from the children. They left Samuel in charge and rode out to a high meadow they had discovered years ago. The wildflowers were in full bloom, painting the ground in every color imaginable. They dismounted and walked hand in hand through the flowers, not talking much, just being together. Finally, they sat on a flat rock overlooking the valley below, where they could see their cabin, smoke rising from the chimney, where Samuel was probably cooking lunch for his siblings. 15 years, Grace said softly. Has it really been 15 years since you walked into that general store and changed my life? 15 years since you changed mine, Ezra corrected. He turned to look at her, his pale eyes still as striking as ever, though his face now bore lines earned through years of laughter and hard work. I never thought I would live to see 50, let alone see it with a wife I love and 4 healthy children. You are only 47, Grace pointed out with a smile. Close enough. Ezra pulled her close against his side. Do you remember when you thought you could never sleep without screaming? When you were so broken you could barely function? I remember, Grace said. It feels like it happened to someone else now, some other Grace in some other life. You fought your way back from that, Ezra said fiercely. With help, yes, but ultimately you did the hard work of healing. I am proud of you, Grace. Proud of the woman you are and the mother you have become. Grace felt tears prick her eyes, the good kind of tears that came from being deeply moved. I could not have done it without you. You held me through every nightmare, every bad night, until they stopped. You gave me the time and space to heal. You saved my life. And you saved mine, Ezra said. He kissed the top of her head. I was existing before I met you, not living. You taught me what it means to have a home again, what it means to love and be loved. Our children are proof that something good can come even from the darkest times. They sat in the meadow until the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Finally, they mounted their horses and rode back toward home, toward the cabin that held everything they loved most in the world. The children greeted them enthusiastically, with Samuel proudly showing off the stew he had made for dinner, and Clara displaying a new drawing of a butterfly she had seen. The twins were arguing about something incomprehensible, but they stopped as soon as Grace walked in, running to hug her legs. That night, after the children were all tucked into their beds and the cabin was quiet, Grace and Ezra lay together in the darkness. Grace's head rested on Ezra's chest, listening to the steady thump of his heart. Thank you, she whispered into the darkness. For what? Ezra asked, his hand stroking her hair in the way that always soothed her. For everything. For seeing me when I was invisible. For taking a chance on a broken stranger. For holding me through the nightmares. For loving me. For giving me this beautiful life. Thank you for letting me, Ezra said simply. For trusting me enough to come to the mountains with me all those years ago. For staying. For loving me back. For our children. For making me whole again. Grace rose up on one elbow to look at him in the moonlight that streamed through their window. His face was beloved and familiar. The face that had been the last thing she saw before sleep, and the first thing she saw upon waking for 15 years. I love you, she said, more now than even that day we married. And I love you, Ezra replied, pulling her down for a kiss. More with every passing year. They made love slowly and tenderly, taking their time as they had learned to do over the years. Afterward, they lay tangled together, perfectly content. Grace drifted toward sleep without any fear, without any dread of what dreams might come, because she knew now, deep in her bones, that the nightmares were truly gone. They had been pushed away by years of love and safety, by a man who had held her through her darkest nights and loved her into wholeness. The last thing she was aware of before sleep took her was Ezra's arm around her waist and his breath stirring her hair. Safe, loved, home. The nightmares had stopped, replaced by dreams of wildflower meadows and children's laughter and a pair of pale blue eyes that promised forever. And in the mountains of Nevada, in a cabin built with love and defended with fierce devotion, Grace Zimmerman slept peacefully through the night, every night, for the rest of her long and happy life. More years passed in their mountain sanctuary. Samuel eventually married a young woman from Eureka, whom he had met during one of their twice-yearly supply trips. Her name was Emma, and she took to mountain life with the same determination Grace had shown years before. They built their own cabin about a mile from Ezra and Grace's, close enough for family, but far enough for independence. Clara surprised everyone by showing no interest in marriage at all. Instead, she announced at 18 that she wanted to become a naturalist and spent her time documenting the flora and fauna of the mountains in detailed sketches and notes. Ezra built her a small studio cabin where she could work undisturbed, and Grace helped her preserve plant specimens and organize her growing collection. The twins, James and Thomas, were inseparable even as they grew into young men. They went into business together as hunting guides, taking wealthy men from back east on expeditions into the high country. They were so skilled that they quickly gained a reputation, and Grace worried about them constantly whenever they were gone, though they always returned safe and full of stories. Grace and Ezra grew older together gracefully. Ezra's hair turned fully silver, and Grace's blonde darkened and showed threads of white. Their hands became rough and weathered from years of hard work, but they remained strong and healthy. They still rode out to their favorite meadow each spring, still sat on the porch together each evening watching the sun set, still slept wrapped in each other's arms every night. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a surprise party. Samuel and Emma brought their 3 grandchildren, Clara decorated with elaborate flower arrangements, and the twins had somehow managed to get a cake all the way up from Eureka without it being completely destroyed. Grace stood in the middle of her cabin, surrounded by her family, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. 25 years ago, she had been a broken young woman who could not sleep without screaming. Now she was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, strong and whole and deeply happy. "Speech!" Thomas called out, and everyone laughed and echoed the call. Grace looked to Ezra, who stood beside her with his arm around her waist. He nodded encouragingly. "I do not have much to say," Grace began, her voice wavering slightly. "Except that 25 years ago, I met a mountain man who saved my life. I was drowning in grief and fear, unable to sleep, unable to function. And he did something that made no sense at all. He invited me to come live in his cabin in the mountains." Everyone laughed, and Grace smiled through sudden tears. "Against all reason, I said yes. And in this cabin, in these mountains, that mountain man held me through every nightmare until they stopped. He gave me time to heal and space to become myself again. He loved me when I was unlovable. He married me and gave me children and built me a life I never dreamed I could have." She turned to look at Ezra, who was suspiciously misty-eyed himself. "Ezra Zimmerman, you are my whole heart. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for these 25 beautiful years." Ezra pulled her into his arms and kissed her soundly, to the cheers and catcalls of their children. When they pulled apart, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Best decision I ever made was walking into that general store. And the second best was convincing you to take a chance on a hermit mountain man." The party lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and more food than even their large family could eat. Grace's grandchildren fell asleep on a pile of blankets by the fire, and Clara's sketches were passed around and admired. Samuel told stories of his father, teaching him to hunt, and the twins did exaggerated impressions of their parents that had everyone crying with laughter. Finally, as the fire burned low and people began to drift off to their own cabins and bedrolls, Grace and Ezra found themselves alone on the porch under a canopy of stars. 25 years, Ezra said softly. Some days it feels like yesterday you walked into my life. Other days it feels like you have always been here. I have been here, Grace said, in every way that matters. This is where I was always meant to be. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, listening to the night sounds of their mountain home. An owl hooted in the distance. The creek sang its eternal song. Inside, one of the grandchildren murmured in sleep, "Do you remember the first night you slept without a nightmare?" Ezra asked suddenly. Grace thought back. It was about 3 months after I came here. I woke up and realized I had slept peacefully all night. I was so surprised I almost could not believe it. I remember, Ezra said. I remember thinking that maybe I had actually helped, that maybe you were going to be okay. More than okay, Grace corrected. I am happy, Ezra. Truly, deeply happy. And it is all because you held me through the darkness until I could find my way to the light. Ezra stood and pulled Grace to her feet, wrapping his arms around her in the way that always made her feel completely safe. We held each other, he said, as he always did. We saved each other, and we built something beautiful together. They stood together under the stars, two people who had found each other against all odds and created a life full of love and meaning. The nightmares that had once tormented Grace were nothing but distant memory now, pushed away by years of Ezra's patient love and the family they had built together. As they went inside to their bed, Grace sent up a silent prayer of thanks to whatever divine providence had led her to that general store in Eureka on that day so many years ago. She had been broken and desperate, and Ezra had offered her hope. She fell asleep that night, as she did every night, in her husband's arms. No nightmares came. There was only peace and love, and the certain knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Grace and Ezra lived many more happy years in their mountain home. They watched their grandchildren grow and eventually saw great-grandchildren as well. They grew old together, their bodies slowing, but their love never dimming. When Grace was 65 years old, Ezra fell ill suddenly during a harsh winter. Despite her best nursing and Samuel riding down to Eureka through dangerous conditions to bring back a doctor, Ezra passed away peacefully in their bed with Grace holding his hand. Grace grieved him deeply, as was natural after 40 years of marriage. But she did not break. She did not shatter the way she had when her parents died. Because Ezra had given her something precious in all their years together, he had made her strong. She lived another 10 years after Ezra's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She stayed in the cabin they had built together, tending her garden and watching the seasons change in the mountains she loved. And every single night, she slept peacefully. No nightmares ever returned. Because even though Ezra was gone, what he had given her remained. The strength, the healing, the knowledge that she was loved and worthy of love. On the anniversary of the day they met, Grace would walk out to their favorite meadow and sit on the rock where they had spent so many afternoons. She would remember the mountain man who had saved her life, who had held her through countless nightmares until they stopped, who had loved her with a fierce and gentle devotion that had healed her broken spirit. When Grace finally passed away peacefully in her sleep at 75 years old, surrounded by 3 generations of family in the cabin where she had found her healing and her home. Her last thought was of Ezra, of his pale blue eyes and his strong arms and his patient love, of the way he had held her through every nightmare until they stopped. And as she drifted away, she could have sworn she felt those strong arms around her one more time and heard his deep voice saying, as he had so many times before, "You are safe, Grace. I have you. You are home." And she was.